Hello, parents and guardians, and welcome back to another Discipleship Debrief. So this past Sunday at youth group, we were back into our series in Mark. We're in Mark chapter 9, verses 14 to 29, in a story that is pretty interesting and confuses a lot of people, honestly. So it is the story of Jesus healing a boy with an unclean spirit. And this boy has had the unclean spirit since childhood. It has tried to kill him multiple times, and the boy's father brings the boy to the disciples looking for Jesus, but he brings them to the disciples first. And the 9 disciples who are left, while Jesus and the other 3 are on the Mount of Transfiguration, are unable to cast out this demon. So, through the story, I highlighted 3 points to kind of look at. And the first was the disciples' inability, the fact that they were unable to cast out the demon. And we asked why. Why were the disciples unable to cast out this demon? Because in Mark chapter 3, they cast out demons. In Mark chapter 6, they cast out demons. And so we had to address that. Why couldn't they cast him out here? And through looking at it and through looking at Scripture, we really addressed the fact that the disciples most likely tried to cast out the demon by their own strength, by their own power, and by the authority that they earlier in Mark possessed because of Jesus, but without Jesus, they didn't have it. So they were probably trying to do something that needed to be done by God without God's help. So then after that, we looked at the father's cry. And the father in this story, the father of this boy with the demon, he asks Jesus to heal his son, and he says, if you can, heal him. And Jesus actually rebukes this lack of faith. And then the father turns around and he says, I do believe, help my unbelief. So we looked at that cry of, I believe, help my unbelief. And I talked about the fact that as believers, we bear these wounds in the faith, and we bear these holes in our faith where we have areas that we need to ask God to shore up our belief and fix our belief. And John Calvin used to say that even as believers, we are still partial unbelievers. We still have areas where we don't truly believe God as fully as we ought to. So I encourage them to follow that cry and say, Lord, I believe, help my unbelief. And then to close, we saw Jesus' ability. Because Jesus, despite the lack of faith of the disciples who don't cast out the demon by his power, and even despite the small faith of the Father in this story, Jesus casts out this demon like that. It's with a single sentence, he casts him out and he says, never return. So Jesus' power and God's power is not affected by what we think. It's not affected by the smallness of our faith. It is the same, and it is transcendent and glorious always. So we looked at that, and I ended up closing with a question. So you as the main discipler of your student, you get to follow up on this question that hopefully they've been thinking about, or maybe you get to reintroduce it to them. And it was, do you find yourself relating more to the disciples in this story, where you're trying to do something by your own might that really should be done by God's power? Right? I use the illustration of anxiety or depression or an addiction and trying to kind of white knuckle your way through it, thinking that if you're just more disciplined, it'll become easier, thinking that if you just gain more control over your thoughts by your own ability, you can fight that anxiety, you can calm yourself within that, without realizing that really that's something that ought to be brought to God. And so that's the first half of the question. Or do you find yourself relating more to the Father in this story, where you're asking God constantly if he can do things, if he's able to do things, if he actually cares, if. If so, go forward and cry out, I believe, help my unbelief. I believe, help my unbelief. Help me to stop making these if statements about God and then simply trusting in his will and trusting that if he wills it, he can. Not if he can, he will. If he wills, he can. So those are the 2 questions to kind of follow up with your student on. I would recommend rereading the passage as well. It's a confusing passage, but it's a wonderful passage, and it has a lot of depth to be explored in it. As always, I'm available as a resource if you need to reach out and ask me any questions. If your student asks you a question that you need to bring to someone else, please reach out, let me know. Otherwise, I'll see you next week.